Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about the weighty issue of equine obesity, and I'm delighted to be joined by Lucy Grieve. Lucy is an ambulatory vet at Rossdales and also the president at BEVA, and we're going to be weighing in and talking about the big subject of equine obesity. So thank you so much, Lucy, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So the concerns with equine obesity, do you think this is a recent problem or in fact something that has accumulated now over a few years?
I think it has been creeping up on us, to be honest. I think probably several decades ago, horses by and large did more work. I think, we had hunters and competition horses, whereas now you see more and more hacking horses, pleasure riders, and even horses that don't have any career, as it were. They're just sort of resting in fields and kept as pets. We've gone from feeding straights a few decades ago to having more of an emphasis on compound feeds, and then it became more about the fibre, and then more recently I think people have really concentrated their sights more on balancers and trying to get the balance right between fibre and what you're feeding as a hard food. So yeah, I think that's definitely been something that's been evolving over time.
And from the veterinary perspective, in terms of the health implications and the welfare implications associated with obesity, certainly I would see way fewer thin horses than I do now predominantly see fat or obese horses. But what are the health implications associated with it?
I can't remember the last time I saw a really underweight horse, to be honest. We know they happen in welfare cases every now and again, but by and large, obesity is the biggest problem, and we're seeing it a lot. From a veterinary point of view, yes, it's the obvious increased weight puts extra strain on the skeleton and the joints and the ligaments and the tendons, but more sort of sinisterly, I suppose, and more undercover, as it were, is the disease process going on inside the animal. So the fat tissue acts as an organ, really, which is what people don't often understand. And the bigger that organ gets, particularly a critical point for each individual, which is different for every individual, it starts to almost poison the body. So it's kicking out all these chemicals into the bloodstream, sort of endocrine system chemicals. And that's what upsets the insulin dysregulation. That's what causes insulin dysregulation. And as a result of that, you can get laminitis. And we still don't even understand the full cascade of events that occurs. That's very much in research, as it were. But yeah, that's the critical thing we've got going on, is the laminitis. That's the huge welfare problem that we have as a result.
I think the word poison as well, I haven't heard that before, but actually that's a very strong and very descriptive word as to how that whole process sort of cascades, really. We know that vets are still the number one go-to for questions about not just veterinary issues, but feeding and feed management. Do you see any differences in feeding trends and feeding fads?
I think, we've seen back when I was a child, people fed straights, didn't they? And then we saw the sort of increase in compound feeds, and then we had people taking much more interest in forage more recently. People are understanding gastric ulcer syndrome and how important forage is to horses. And then what I've seen more recently, which is great, is an interest in balancers. And I find, just going on my routine calls, annual vaccinations, people are actually asking more often, am I feeding the right thing? Should I be feeding a balancer? Whereas I'd say even 10 years ago, 5 years ago perhaps even, that was much less known about, I'd say, in the average horse owning population. So it's good that people are taking that interest in what their horse needs and trying to bring back, the essentials and try and return the fibre to the diet as much as possible. So in that respect, it's been great. I suppose supplements is the only other faddy thing, and the fashionable stuff that varies a lot over time, and it just depends entirely on what seems to be getting the headlines in the equestrian press, as it were. But by and large, I'm sort of find people very receptive about what's a good supplement, what's a bad supplement. And when you talk to them, they realise, what's already in the feed, what they don't need to be adding, versus what might be a waste of money or unrequired, and versus what actually is a good supplement that will do the horse some good. So that's a nice change that I've seen more recently.
And about as well, it's communicating that information, isn't it, in a fashion and a manner where it's easy to understand. There's been a big explosion in the information out there with regards to social media, Instagram, the place to be, a lot of different groups and forums being set up now with people going to those sources to ask questions and get information. How do you find that in terms of other ways in which perhaps we can control that? What do we need to be communicating?
It's a tricky one because like you say, it has many advantages. It's easily accessed. People can look stuff up with the touch of a button. And it does encourage discussion, and I like that. You know, there's a positive element to it. It encourages people to pick up on new advice and find out things, but absolutely trying to filter the good and the bad is the tricky bit. Certainly don't take other people's advice, you know, on face value. You know, don't assume that these other horse owners, just because their horse has responded badly to something, that yours will. So again, it's drumming home that every horse is individual, every management system and yard and, you know, routine is individual, and that will all have an impact. So getting tailored advice again is just really, really vital.
So really individual being one of the key words there. As a company, and I myself, we like to do a lot of the body condition scoring, fat scoring. It's certainly a system that I love doing it. I love working with my clients doing that, and would rely more on that than the weigh bridge and weight monitoring. Obviously that's important. Clearly, body condition scoring as well has its restrictions, because what we see on the outside, we can't also see and feel on the inside. Do you have any other tips as to how people can help monitor and monitor their horse's body condition?
I think you've really exactly hit the problem, which is, you know, weigh bridges are fantastic, but they do just give you a total weight of the horse. So it doesn't tell you exactly that whether it's fat or muscle composition and what that ratio is. So that's more important. And the fact that we know now as well that individuals have different tolerance to fat. So some horses won't tolerate even a small amount of fat gain. So, you know, just a slight crest or a slight bit of rump fat might be really, really dangerous for one individual horse, compared to another horse which might tolerate a bit more. No horse would obviously tolerate huge amounts, but it's just to make those individuals aware that actually you've got to know your horse. You've got to be really careful even about small amounts of weight gain, because they can be dangerous for some horses. And so learning to be familiar with those ways of weight gain are really important. You're absolutely right about the abdominal fat. You can't measure that, so that's really hard. They can obviously start to look a little bit bigger in their abdomen, so arguably a belly girth measurement or heart girth measurement, and keeping on top of those, because it's the change that's important, not the actual measurement, it's how much it's going up and down. They can give you a gauge, but ultimately we have to assume that if a horse is sort of fat in the crest and the rump and elsewhere, then it's probably going to have quite a reasonable amount of abdominal fat, which is just totally adding to the whole problem.
We've sort of discussed really as well and mentioned that the obesity epidemic issue has been rumbling on for a number of years, and yet it's not a new subject. There's a lot of information that is available out there in the press and social media, and yet clearly it seems that we're not able to be communicating the messages with regards to not necessarily the risks associated, but actually how we can start to get more control of this issue. So, you know, how do we take this forward in communicating and making these messages clearer to the general public to help improve the health and welfare of our horses?
Yeah, and that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And we talk about that a lot at BEVA in the veterinary community, is that the information out there about obesity, its effects on the horse, how we should be reducing it, or, you know, better doing weight management, it's all there, isn't it? The information's there, and it's brilliant information. And that, you know, some of the horse charities have given out excellent advice for owners, and you guys are constantly doing wonderful things in the nutrition and feed industry. Why is that message just not having the desired effect? And something that we as vets have been looking into carefully is is it because the owners don't recognise it? Is it because they want to bury their head in the sands? Is it because it's really hard to put that information and that advice into practice? And I think it's obviously inevitably a mixture of all of those things and different for different people. So trying to perhaps target, the horse owning population in different ways is probably really important, because I think some owners really do know that their horse is overweight. It might be one of those sort of native types that's really, really weight loss resistant, like no matter, if they're fed on fresh air, they still seem to keep their fat. And I think there is an element of truth in some of those. Some of these horses really, really don't lose weight very easily, even on sort of negative calorie diets, when you look at some of the research. So we have to sort of try and think of different ways of handling those situations and trying to support those owners, versus the owner that really doesn't think their horse is overweight. They just think it's a cresty horse, or it's the breed, or that's just him, he's always been like that. And they're the harder ones to deal with, because you've got to work really hard to try and convince them of the truth that's really there under their nose. So I think, yes, there's always going to be, I think, different tools that we have to use to try and communicate with these owners, depending on almost which subtype they fall into, which category are they falling into. And that's where I think, from a nutritionist point of view, from a veterinary point of view, even physios, saddlers, we all need to be trying to sing from the same hymn sheet to try and help these messages sort of really get home, as it were. It's sort of drumming home the right message, but to the right person in the right way, isn't it? And it comes again back to that tailor-made advice thing, where there's no point telling the horse owner that's at a livery yard to reduce their grazing if they have absolutely no control over which field their horse goes in. So that's where you need to think about other forms of calorie intake reduction, or grazing muzzles, or so there's different solutions for every situation. Actually trying to get the right solution for that individual is so important in order to help them stick to it and see it through.
So I guess one of the big questions as well that people maybe want to know is, what does good, healthy, optimum body condition score look like?
That is a very hard question. We've probably normalised fat horses in a way. I think over the years, big shiny crests and big peachy bottoms have been what makes the covers and what makes the adverts and what wins in the show ring. So we have to try and take away that bias that we've all sort of been force-fed by accident. No one did it intentionally, it's just how things have happened. So I think it's good to just recalibrate ourselves and think, you don't have to go to the extremes of what does a feral horse look like on the Mongolian steppe, or or a Brumby horse or something, because yes, they probably do look a bit ropey because they're living in the wilds, but actually for the ecosystem they're in and their nutrition and their metabolism, they're probably looking great. So we want to think, well, what's right for a horse that's doing this job or living in a field 24/7, all year round, versus one that might be stabled more and things like that. And actually, when it comes down to the real crux of it, it is purely, does that horse have the appropriate muscle versus the appropriate fat? And very few horses need the fat. If they were going to go and live out in Siberia, yes, they probably do want to get a little bit of a fat store ready for winter, but none of our horses in the UK are ever under huge amounts of, environmental strain or pressure. So we, I think, within this country particularly, just need to remind ourselves of that, that actually they don't need the fat stores to stay healthy. So if we think about taking the fat out of the equation, what should the crest look like, and the neck and the rump should really be muscle. And so trying to work out what those two things look and feel like does require professional help, because it's really hard to see. You can't show in a picture really easily. It's about what it feels like, how the horse looks, how it works, and all those other things. So I think probably that's where you have to get your advice from a nutritionist or a vet or both, and discuss it together,
And what about the sort of long-term future? Where do we need to be going? So kind of sort of like short, medium, long-term goals. Where do you see the future?
I think it's going to always be evolving and improving as we go. We're learning more about nutrition all the time, as you know. We're understanding more about the metabolic diseases that occur in horses. And so over time in general, I think information will come to light that we'll wish we'd known back in the day and even now. So I think keeping our eyes on the ball and looking at the research in a really pragmatic way is important. But in the short term, I think the information we've got is really good already. And I think putting that into practice and putting it in place with owners on an individual basis, we will start to see better results. But I think we have to be really careful and really considered about how we treat individual owners and individual horses, rather than just assuming one size fits all and giving these blanket rules and advice, because that doesn't always help and it doesn't always work for some.
And again, it's that word coming back again, isn't it? Individual systems and advice in place. So Saracen Horse Feeds, we're always open to criticism, praise. This is how we learn. We're always learning and we're always striving to improve. And our priorities do lie with our clients and with their horses and ponies to promote the health and the welfare and the longevity of them. So, a few things from you. What do you think that we could start by doing? What do we need to be perhaps prioritising to help what ultimately you and your team are working towards?
I think that it goes probably back to the teamwork thing and the communication. From the nutritionist point of view and the feed company point of view, I as a vet would love to get involved more with certainly weight management with individual clients, because they've always got multiple sort of things to consider apart from the management. If a horse has arthritis, it's no good saying we need to increase the exercise, because it might be that it can't do any more than it's doing, or if the owner's got a very busy job and can't ride it more times a week. So I think when we all sit around a bit of a table, even virtually, you could do it over sort of video messaging and things like that, then I think you get a better result, because that owner's going to feel way more supported when they're getting the right advice from all aspects, as it were, and all lines of communication. So I would just definitely like to see more of that. And I do enjoy the kind of weight clinics. And some people sort of say, well, you're kind of preaching to the converted, because the people that come to the weight clinics are the ones that are interested, and actually the ones you really want to get to are the ones that don't sort of want to know about the problem or haven't accepted or considered there's a problem. But I think that again is just allowing that information to start to diffuse across horse owners and yards, and I'm seeing that more and more. Is maybe one of the good bits about social media is people mentioning that they've had nutrition advice from a professional and their vet's been involved, or they've had a weight clinic at the yard or at their vet's practice, and then that sort of sows a seed hopefully in some other people's minds. So I guess in the ideal world I'd like to see just more of the same, but perhaps just being even more showcased and talked about, so that we can try and lead by example to those that are a bit more resistant to the idea that there's an issue there for them to have to look and address.
Lucy, you've been absolutely wonderful. I've really enjoyed our chat. I could talk all day to experts like yourself, but I think we've covered a huge amount of information, and really it's just about going out there, drip feeding, encouraging and providing that level of support. So thank you so much for your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me. No, it's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.